Recording has started. Welcome to the AI session. Take it away, Asa.
Awesome. And I'm assuming you guys can see the screen?
Yep. Audio, video, and screen all look good.
Fantastic. And I'm going to move all of y'all so I can see you without staring off onto my other screen. Yeah. So, hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am one of the co-founders for the Earth Species Project, along with Britt Selvatel. And we are a nonprofit and do our work open source, and we are dedicated to translating animal communication using sort of these new advanced machine learning tools. We've been around for just around 3 years now, and are 5 people working full time. There's Katie, who's in Miami. There's me and Britt, who are here in Berkeley. Radek Omulski, who on our AI team, he's in Poland. And then Peter Bermant, who's in Utah. It's Peter who's going to be doing most of the presenting today. Katie will sort of talk at the end. And the way these things go, just discovered that Peter's computer crashed when opening up Zoom. And so he is quietly, frantically trying to get everything back up and running. So I might prevaricate just a little longer. But we think of ourselves as tool makers as well as researchers. And wanted to start by just giving a whole bunch of thanks to everyone here. All of this work is only made possible by the incredible dedication and decades of research that has come before. So like a huge thank you to like the interspecies.io crew, Diana Reiss, who we get to collaborate with, Peter and Vint and Neil. And then just to sprinkle a couple of the people that we're super excited we get to work with, there's like Alaska Whale Foundation and Fred Sharp and SETI and Lawrence Doyle. Part of that collaboration I see here, Lisa Walker's on the call. We work with like UC Davis and Brendan McCowan and Woods Hole with Layla Singh, and Project SETI is a partner with David Gruber and Shane Giro and Michael Bronstein and a whole slew of others, and Cornell with Michelle Fournette. And just, there are so many people. One of the things that's been so exciting, especially about this year for us, is that, 3 years ago when we started talking about like, hey, maybe we can use advanced machine learning to translate animal communication, there weren't that many of the people we saw sort of like thinking about same things. And this year there's an entire field of people, and that community just makes us really excited. So wanted to give just a little context for today's workshop, which will be pretty technical in nature. Brief background. So one of the reasons why we began in 2017 was this breakthrough in the field of unsupervised machine translation. And there is, in the way these things go, there were 2 papers back to back, one from University of Basque Country, one from Facebook. And what unsupervised machine translation is, it's a study of how do you translate between 2 languages, understand what the language says if you have no examples of how to translate, no dictionary, and no Rosetta Stone. And the technique was pretty clever. It's, you build a shape that represents a language. The technical term is like, latent space or an embedding. And you do that for one language, say Japanese, another language, say German, and you can translate by rotating one shape on top of the other. You're sort of using one language as a key to decode another language. And the idea that you could match structure to structure in this unsupervised way to translate between 2 languages that you had no idea what they meant, that said, maybe there is finally a path in these technologies to start, teasing apart what these things mean. And there's actually been a whole bunch more that's happened since those discoveries. And really what we're saying is that we have these powerful new tools operating on new scales of data and sensors. How would we go about using these language models on animal vocalizations? And so our work really is split into sort of like 2 broad buckets. There's sort of the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. And the top-down approach says, let's extend what's already been working for human languages further. So for right now, people have demonstrated this unsupervised translation from text to text and from audio to text. But as far as we know, we haven't been able to find anyone that's gone directly from audio to audio. Just listen to German, listen to Japanese, learn how to translate between the two using these sort of semantic representations. And so that's the work that's part of the work that we're beginning. And Radicals Molsky is sort of leading that work. And I should point out, when I say everything is open source, we really try to make everything open source. So here's our GitHub. It's available github.com/species. Everything you see today is essentially in here. And so the unsupervised audio translation, you can just come to and dive in, check out the issues and get involved. So that's sort of one. The other side is the bottom-up approach, which is saying we learn a lot by getting just really close to the data and seeing what the data has to teach. But working with raw data, as we've been discovering, and as field biologists have known for a very long time, is difficult because it's noisy. Animals aren't always super cooperative. It's hard. And so the bottom-up approach, it's sort of two parts to that. One is we're working on this thing, the Earth Species Library, and the Earth Species Library is sort of a collection of animal data sets that are tuned for machine learning, and then a pipeline on top of it, which makes experimentation really easy, both within a species and across species. So that's available here at the library. We have a couple data sets that are already ready and available. And actually we're working with, I think I saw him, Mark Graham, the Internet Archive, to store all this stuff in perpetuity. But this we're really excited about because it just makes it really easy to start experimenting. And on top of that, we've started by building this acoustic representation toolbox, which says, how do you represent audio the best for these neural networks? Working with audio, raw audio can be challenging because there's so many timescales you have to deal with, but spectrograms have their own trade-offs. So we're going to be diving into our findings there. And the second sort of part is solving these fundamental biology and computation challenges. And the one that we're working on now is the cocktail party problem. So quick reminder on the cocktail party problem, it's the problem of you're standing in a crowded cocktail party. How is it that you can hear just the person you're talking to and not get distracted by everyone else, right? It's the equivalent of listening to an orchestra and being able to pick out just an oboe or just the bassoon. And our brains somehow can do it, but our computers haven't been able to. And actually something I learned from Joyce Poole, from the Elephant Listening Project, who I think I saw on this call, is that 56% of the time that elephants vocalize, they overlap. And for dolphins, the more dolphins there are in a pod, there's a nonlinear increase in the amount of vocalizations and the range of vocabulary. So it'd be pretty amazing if you could tease apart multiple speakers at once into their individual tracks. So eventually we could feed them into these language models. And that's the problem that we've been working on. And dealing with the cocktail party problem forces us to deal also with solving noise, learning to identify voice or identity from voice, or a whole bunch of other things. So that is sort of the brief overview of what we're working on. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Peter now to actually dive in. And finally, you can just see my my email address down here for anyone that wants to get in touch. You ready, Peter?
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing and you want to grab the screen?
Definitely. Okay. Yeah, so thanks, Asa, for the introduction and background. So as Asa mentioned—
Sorry, Peter, can you zoom in a little bit for the video? Just zoom the browser. Good.
Okay, yeah, so as Asa mentioned, at Earth Species, we've been applying a number of sort of revolutionary cutting edge machine learning based technologies to animal vocalizations. And we've been taking a very broad approach that includes both addressing global problems, such as the cocktail party problem, but we've also kind of dived deep into the low-level problems. And as many of you might be familiar with some of these problems that are kind of characteristic of bioacoustic data. Some of these include, for instance, the variable time scale in animal vocal behavior. For instance, sperm whales, they make clicks that are on the order of a temporal order of milliseconds, but then they can concatenate these clicks into series on the order of seconds or longer, a series of clicks called codas. So that's one fundamental problem. Another example might be noise that's present in data. And even another could be something such as domain shift, where some data is recorded on one set of recording devices, and then another data is recorded on somewhat different environments on different microphones. And so then in this talk, I'm planning on looking at one of the issues, which is how best to represent bioacoustic signals. And then I'll kind of link this to how this fits into the bigger global problem of the cocktail party problem. So with that, I'd like to get into this representation toolbox. As Asa mentioned, this is all available open source on GitHub. Anyone can access it. If anyone has questions, feel free to reach out. Yeah, so with that, I have a little summary overview of what's in the toolbox. And so for this demonstration, there are generally two sort of main categories of, if we like boil it down to the most fundamental level, there's sort of two categories of bioacoustic vocalizations that we tend to see. These can be kind of tonal or harmonic sounds. For instance, this orca call. Or else they can be broadband or transient. Just boiling that down to two main categories. So here's sperm whale clicks. So then with this, this leads so now that we have these recordings, how do we represent these recordings in a way that we can input them into machine learning models for downstream tasks? So a very kind of the first approach is to look at the time and frequency space representations. So for our orca call and our sperm whale click, we just plot the amplitude of these sound waves as a function of time. So this is essentially just the pressure wave hitting the microphone as a function of time, and that's what we see here. And as I mentioned before with the variable time scales, here we see that the orca call is on the order of a second or around a second. And then the sperm whale click is fractions of seconds, milliseconds. And then we can look at the frequency domain and look at the frequency components that comprise these signals. And so as is characteristic of these tonal calls, we see localized peaks. Whereas for something like the sperm whale click, we see kind of a broad range of many frequencies. You can also note the scales on the frequency axis here. So this is kind of like the first pass. This is what we do when we see the data. We just look at these raw time domain and frequency domain, but oftentimes with machine learning models, it's often challenging to use raw audio directly as input. For instance, if we're recording, say, dolphins at, say, 72 kilohertz, a sampling rate, then in 1 second, we'll have 72,000 data points, which can be hard. It can be hard for machine learning models to make use of these long-term dependencies. So this leads to an idea called feature engineering, where we construct different sorts of representations to feed into machine learning models. And so with that, in human speech, it's very conventional to go to the spectrogram domain, and then to scale the spectrogram to the Mel scale, which is optimized kind of to reflect human auditory perception. But then with animal sounds, the animal vocalizations often differ significantly from human vocalizations. So does it make sense to say, use a Mel spectrogram on a dolphin whistle that's at on the order of 10 kilohertz? So these are the sorts of questions that we want to address, how best to represent bioacoustic signals. So as I mentioned, a spectrogram is a very conventional or traditional approach to representing these signals. For instance, this is what the orca call looks like. And so with the spectrogram, as many of you might be familiar with, we're plotting the intensity of the sound as a function of both time and frequency. But with the spectrogram, there's many parameters to consider when constructing them. And as of now, there's no a priori approach for selecting them. It's often, let's do a visual analysis and see what looks the best. So with this in mind, we change how there's a parameter that has to do with this sliding window over which we compute this transform. And by changing this parameter, we can alter we can change how the representation appears. And this has to do with a characteristic drawback of spectrograms, which is this uncertainty between temporal and spectral resolution. If we increase the time resolution, the temporal resolution of spectrograms, then we decrease the frequency resolution, and vice versa. If we increase frequency resolution, we decrease temporal resolution. So that means that somewhere in the middle, we find a happy medium that optimizes this representation. And you might ask why this is important. So there's a paper, and they found that simply by optimizing the parameters, they're able to increase classification accuracies from about 90% to 97%. And as I said before, there's no a priori approach for automating this search. It's generally just a there's no real a priori approach to choosing these parameters. So then what we've done is we've tried to develop an automated approach, and we have two methods for doing so. One is an entropy-based approach to characterize the entropy in these spectrograms as a proxy for information. Another one is this goodness function here, which uses principal component analysis as a proxy for the features contained in this representation. And so if we run this optimization scheme, then we find that with small windows, we see here that there's very good temporal resolution, but very poor frequency resolution. At the opposite side of the spectrum, with a wide window width, we see poor temporal resolution, but fantastic frequency resolution. And then the optimization scheme finds the happy medium in the middle. And so this is just a simple one. This is just the simple 1D goodness manifold. But in the representation toolbox on GitHub, we also explore higher dimensional manifolds optimizing more parameters. But this is just a simple experiment. So then with this in mind, this kind of concludes the conventional spectrogram-based approach. And so I mentioned that paper where just by changing parameters, they're able to increase downstream classification accuracies. So we ask, why not optimize the representation itself? So this leads to a number of representations, and many of them are included in the toolbox. So feel free to check out those. To start off with, there's a slight modification of spectrograms, and it's this time frequency reassignment algorithm. And so using this algorithm, we can achieve sharper resolutions. So for instance, if we use this algorithm, then our ORCA spectrogram now looks like this, which can be compared with this. So we see that there's sharper resolution, and we kind of, we use this algorithm to kind of pseudo bypass our time frequency uncertainty. So this is just an example of how a different representation might yield kind of sharper results. And so with this in mind, I wanted to introduce a very simple baseline classifier just to show how a machine learning model works with this data. So now that we have these 2D image data sets, we can use what's called a convolutional neural network. And so for this, I'll use a macaque coup call data set. And so this is the raw waveform domain. And what these are these are macaque coups that are labeled according to the identity of the vocalizing macaque. And so then we can go to a spectrogram representation here. And so these are what the spectrograms of these individual macaque coups look like. So class 4 would be one macaque, class 1 would be a different macaque, and we're asking a model to classify the identity of the vocalizing macaque based on the spectrogram of its call. Here we use a convolutional neural network, as I mentioned, a CNN, and these are structured based on the visual. They're kind of inspired by the human visual cortex, in that they look at a receptive field and carry out a convolution over that receptive field, and they extract features from data in this hierarchical manner, in the sense that they start by looking at edges, and then they build textures, patterns, parts, and objects. And they use these hierarchically extracted features to carry out classification tasks with extremely high degrees of accuracy. So here we just build a very, very simple baseline classifier with 2 convolutional layers. And using this simple model, we can yield an accuracy of 98.7, almost 98.7% in classifying the identity of the vocalizing macaque. So this kind of is a clear demonstration of the power of machine learning techniques. But so then, as I mentioned before, why spectrograms? So it's been conventional to use spectrograms, but there are a couple of drawbacks to spectrograms. For instance, the time frequency uncertainty that I mentioned before, and then another one has to do with the fact that spectrograms differ significantly from images, which CNNs tend to be optimized for image data. So this leads to this concept called the wavelet scattering transform. And the construction is somewhat technical, but it's essentially a convolutional network with filters that are not learnable, but they're wavelets instead. And so it forms this cascade of higher and higher order kind of coefficients, where the 0th order is essentially just a low pass filter. And then we have this cascade that passes through this essentially a non-trainable convolutional neural network or convolutional network. And so to motivate this transform, there are kind of a couple of ideas at play. The first is that CNNs have traditionally been optimized for image data, and image data it possesses a number of invariances. So for instance, if we look at a picture of a puppy, right, then we can transform the puppy, we can rotate it, we see that it's still a puppy. We can zoom in, we see it's still a puppy, translate, it's still that puppy. Reflect and mirror, again, it's still a puppy. So image data, it possesses these symmetry group invariances. And you might wonder like why this is important. But so symmetry group invariance is a very, very fundamental concept in nature. And it plays a extremely important role in a variety of fields, ranging from, say, particle physics interactions to explaining maybe why some chemical compound is completely safe while its enantiomer might be completely hazardous, right? So these symmetries play super important roles in nature. And unlike image data, spectrograms do not obey these sorts of invariances. So for instance, if we have we can play just a simple chirp, for example. So we have, that's just a simple chirp call, for example, and here's what our original spectrogram would look like. But then what happens if we do these transformations? Let's rotate it. Does it sound the same? Or if we zoom in, not the same. So with all of these, we can shift it. Different. And for an extreme example, this is what's known as a Mordna lap. So I'll play, I can play this recording. Bats. Saying bats, right? And here's what our spectrogram looks like. Bats. So now we saw that image data possesses this reflection invariance. What happens if we reflect this spectrogram? Stab. We hear stab. So by reflecting this spectrogram, we completely alter the meaning of the signal. So this kind of demonstrates that spectrograms are a very different beast from image data. And why this might be relevant is that convolutional neural networks, they capitalize on local continuous transformation invariance. So if you locally rotate an image, it's the CNN should be able to recognize the image is still that image. It's not necessarily globally invariant or invariant to discontinuous transformations such as that reflection, but at least it respects this local invariance to shift to translation or rotations. So then with this in mind, this leads to this idea of this scattering wavelet transform, which leads to a locally invariant, a locally temporally invariant transformation or representation that might make sense to use with a convolutional neural network. And so one other point to mention with this is oftentimes in machine learning, it's useful to use these pre-trained networks to carry out classification tasks. So for instance, there's a kind of canonical task of classifying images of dogs and cats, or dog species and cat species, or breeds. So it's oftentimes people take these networks that are trained on thousands and thousands and thousands of these ImageNet database images, and they fine-tune these pre-trained models to carry out image classification tasks with very high degrees of accuracy. But we've noticed, and it's by no means conclusive, but we've noticed that using these pre-trained models has not necessarily led to fantastic improvements when working with spectrogram data sets, and this could possibly explain one reason why. But so then with this in mind, we'll proceed to the scattering wavelet transformation. And this is what these coefficients look like. So as I mentioned, the 0th order is essentially a low pass filter. Then this is the first order and the second order coefficients, and these contain most of the acoustic energy. So we don't really need to go higher order. So then now that we have this representation, this is once again a macaque call. We can build a slightly more advanced topology for this CNN model. And instead of using one input and one output, we can now map 2 inputs to 1 output. So our 2 inputs will be these two coefficients. This will be one input, this will be another input, and this is called a multi-head model. And so we build this classifier very similar to the one before, and we train this classifier. We see that when we start training, it's a relatively low accuracy, right? But then as it sees the data, it learns to extract features in that hierarchical manner I talked about earlier. So in the end, we achieve accuracies on the order of 99%. And so we see a slight improvement over the spectrogram-based approach, but we've also possibly saturated our capacity using this particular data set, which is why we like to explore tons of data in our ESP library. And so this example demonstrates just the power of using different representations to carry out the same classification task. But not only have we been looking at these kind of non-learnable representations, we also have a deep learned approach. And so many of these approaches involve using what's known as a generative model. And some of these include what's known as a generative adversarial network, or GAN, a variational autoencoder, a VAE, or some other more advanced architecture, such as a gradient origin network, which is a very novel type of generative model. And so with this, we start off by asking our machine learning model to reconstruct data. So we give it the data as input, and we want it to learn to reconstruct this data. So here's a little video demonstrating how one of these models reconstructs data. So this is as it sees the data more and more, it starts to build a higher fidelity reconstruction. As we see here at the end of learning, we see that the reconstruction faithfully resembles the data. And so why this is important is that these machine learning models, what they do oftentimes is they take the input, say a picture of my face, right? For example, they'll take the picture of my face and they'll condense it down to a smaller number of variables. So this is called a latent space. So they condense it down to this latent space. So for instance, for the picture of my face, maybe they'll take my eyes, my nose, my mouth, my ears, or some combination thereof. And then you ask it to rebuild a reconstruction from those that smaller dimensional space. And the power of this method is we can see enhanced clustering in these latent space representations. So for instance, with these macaque coo calls, we can dive into this latent space. And so for this example, we start with these spectrograms. We ask this model to condense a spectrogram down to 128 dimensions. So these are like the dimensions I was talking about, could be my eyes, my nose, my mouth, for example, if we were working with the image of my face. But so we asked this machine learning model to build this latent space representation. And then here I take those 128 dimensions and then I further reduce the dimensionality so that we can visualize it. But we can, and then, so this is just for visualization purposes, but we can also, and then this is explored in the Earth Species Acoustic Representation Toolbox GitHub, we run classification models using the latent space representation. So instead of using the original input, we use this 128 dimensional vector. And so then here's another visualization of this latent space. And so this is a very similar approach where we take that 128 dimensional vector and again, condense it down to a smaller number of elements. And then we plot them. This is kind of like a Fourier series, but the coefficients are the elements of these lower dimensional vectors. And each of these curves, each of these colors corresponds to one macaque coo identity, right? So this pink one is one macaque. This green one is another macaque. Purple, another teal, another, right? So these are all, we're able to visualize the clustering of these macaques. And so that's the kind of the power of these generative models, is we are able to just strongly cluster. But there are also a number of advantages to using these deep learned methods. For instance, at our species, we've developed a completely novel approach to noise reduction. As far as I know, as far as we know, this is essentially the first of its kind at completely self-supervised noise reduction. There are some existing self-supervised noise reduction algorithms, but this one enables us to achieve denoising simply by using background. So what we ask, as I showed before with that generative model, we ask it to reconstruct the data. Here, we're feeding one of those generative models just background noise. So we ask it to build its representation of background noise. So then what that means is when we feed it, say, a dolphin whistle, it's never seen a dolphin whistle before. So it has no idea how to reconstruct the dolphin whistle. However, it has seen the background noise. So it does know how to create this background noise. So here we see, this is our original dolphin whistle spectrogram. We feed it into our generative model. It has no idea how to reconstruct this whistle, but it reconstructs the background noise. And then we subtract this off to yield our completely noiseless representation. And so many of you might be familiar with something like a bandpass filter as a common approach for denoising like bioacoustic signals. And so while this could be great for working with raw audio, when working with something like a spectrogram, often these bandpass filters lie outside the zone of support for these representations. So this is around, say, 10 to 15 kilohertz. And if we were to apply a low pass filter, or a bandpass filter, sorry, then we would still preserve all the noise in this band. It wouldn't filter out this noise. And so this novel denoising algorithm enables us to completely to remove noise in a completely self-supervised fashion. So this kind of demonstrates the power of these deep learned representations. So then with this, we have a number of other representations that we've explored and are continuing to explore in our toolbox on GitHub. These include the Hilbert-Huang transform, which has been suggested to be of use for something like the cocktail party problem. But we also have others such as the continuous wavelet transform, spectral hyperresolution, among others. And so with this, I wanted to lead into one final representation that acts as a segue to that global problem of the cocktail party problem that I was mentioning. So with this, we have a fully learned encoded representation. So for this, I'll look at a couple of chirps. So here's what these chirps sound like. And so as before with that generative model, I can play those again. So as before with that generative model, we ask a network to encode the model and then to invert the model, or invert the representation, to encode the original input and then to invert that encoded representation. So you can think of this to some degree like a spectrogram, or an STFT and an ISTFT, where we take the spectrogram and then we invert this spectrogram to get the signal back. This is kind of a play on that, where now instead of using a spectrogram, we have a learnable representation. So we can train this train this model. And so what we're doing here is we're training it to reconstruct that original the original audio. And so we can hear the reconstruction. So we hear a relatively high fidelity reconstruction. And then just for visual, we can plot the visualizations of these just to compare them with our traditional spectrogram. So here's what our spectrogram representation looks like for one of the chirps. And here's what our spectrogram representation looks like for the other chirp. And these are no surprises here. This is exactly what we would expect for these spectrograms. But then we go into these deep encoded representations, and our model has learned a representation of this audio, of these acoustic signals. And so with this in mind, this acts as a segue to talk about how we use these representations to address some of the more global problems that we've been attacking at Earth species. So here's the cocktail party problem, and we make use of some of these representations in this. This is once again open source on GitHub, and in this we again use the macaque data set, and we have a relatively recent, there's a recent update that hasn't been posted quite yet, but with this Colab version, we can run it in Colab, which is an interactive in-browser, like an in-browser interactive way to run code. So, I mean, it's really fun to play with. Totally suggest running through this notebook. But so then to just demonstrate how we're attacking the cocktail party problem, we're once again using the macaque data set. And in the human speech domain, a conventional way for forming data sets, for instance, one of the common data sets is known as WSJ0-2 or 0-N mix. These are formed by taking two speakers and concatenating them together to form a composite waveform, or adding them together to form a composite waveform. So of two overlapping speakers. So then what that means is we have the separated ground truths. So we have a similar approach here where we take two speakers and we add them together to form an overlapping input. So then what we do is we go and build a model. And so for this project, we wanted to focus on building a very intuitive model, a very lightweight model with ideally as few parameters as we can. And something that was intuitive. So we decided on this UNet style architecture. And so what this UNet does is it starts with this, it starts with the original input, and then it downsamples it, and then it upsamples until you have the output, and along the way, information leaks across. And so we can build this model, and this is what our model looks like, where it's these downsampling blocks here, and then these upsampling blocks here, and along the way, information leaks. And so here we can see that this model has just over 1.4 million parameters. And then, so we train this model, and we train it using the absolute error on the original signal. And then we have this metric that's kind of a de facto standard in this field, known as the scale invariant signal to distortion ratio. And we see that as we pass through the data more and more times, the loss goes down, so our error goes down, and this metric increases. So we see better performance in separating our signals as our model learns. And so we ran a baseline using one of the using a baseline classifier or a baseline model known as ConvTestNet, and using that model has 5 million parameters, so over 2 times more parameters. It takes about twice as long to run, and in the end, it achieves a slightly lower scale invariant signal to distortion ratio, but it also doesn't generalize as well to these unseen test data. But so this demonstrates the power of this lightweight model, in that it executes relatively quickly with a high degree of accuracy or performance, and it generalizes well to unseen data. So we can explore the results of this. And so here, this is a visual representation. So here's what our mixture looks like, and this is our original input. And then, so this is the original ground truths. This is one source, and this is the other source. So just to reiterate, this original mixture is formed by adding these two together, source 1 and source 2. And then we ask the model to separate the mixture into the respective sources. So that's what these two these are the reconstructed separations. So as we can visually inspect, the waveforms match up reasonably well. And then we can also look at spectrograms just as another visual representation. And so we see here, this is one source, and this is the separated source, and here's another source, and then the separated version. And then, so just as a final little example, we can just concatenate some of these together just for fun, just to see how our model performs. So here's our original cocktail party problem. And this is what our mixture looks like. And then we ask our model to separate the sources. And so then these are the ground truths, and these are the separations. And if we play these, here's the ground truth source. And then here's our separated reconstruction. And then if we go to the other source, this is the ground truth and our separation. One more time. So we can both visually and so here we visually inspect the results. Here it's an auditory example of the results. So we see that our model has learned to separate a cocktail party problem. And then just to tie this in with the representation toolbox, is we can, for this particular task, we use that last fully encoded learnable representation that I talked about. So then this is what that representation looks like for the mixture. And then for the separations, this is what our representation looks like. So it by no means looks like our spectrogram representations, but clearly our machine learning models have learned some powerful representation that enables it to carry out this very challenging task of source separation with a very high degree of performance. So this concludes my talk regarding both the low-level and high-level problems that we're addressing at Earth Species Project. So I'd love to pass it to our Chief of Impact and Conservation Technology, Katie Zakarian.
Well, I'll intercept for just 1 second because Katie,
Okay.
we'll get to you. We just have 3 questions that I want to ask from up in the chat. We'll move backwards in time. So the first question is from Franz Jensen and asks, will this work as well if you only have only novel data in the mixture, i.e. use calls that the network hasn't learned?
I not sorry. Could you repeat that, Asa?
Will this work as well if you have only novel data in the mixture? That is, you use calls that the network hasn't learned yet.
Okay. So with this particular task, this is still a very introductory, like our first pass through. It's a very recent development, essentially within the past week or two. But so here, let's see, I'll go to, there's one line of code or two lines of code. So here what we're doing is we're separating our original data into a training and testing set. And so what these are here we're taking two individuals and we're adding them together. We're taking two other individuals, adding them together. And then so what we're doing is we have this full data set but then we separate that into testing segments and training segments. And so they're technically the same individual, or they are the same individuals, and it is the same overlaps, but they're different calls, slightly different calls, right? So it's just the training data set is what we allow the network to see. The testing data set is what we don't allow the network to see. And then we we evaluate the performance of our model on this unseen holdout test set. And so like it's worth, as we proceed farther through this, we're definitely like planning to add higher and higher amounts of data. But for this, we do have unseen holdout tests. And if we go down, we see that it generalizes well in that here's our mean absolute error for the trained data set. And here's when we evaluate, here's the mean absolute error for the testing data set. And then here's that SI-SDR metric for the training data set, and then the unseen test data set. So that is something that we've taken into account when carrying out this analysis. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Then we had a question from Irina.
Okay.
How does this approach compare? This is going back to the denoising. But okay. How does the approach compare against a denoising autoencoder?
So, oops, what happened here? We have, again, this is just, let's see, oops, it's not in this one. This is not something that we've been like fully investigated at this point. This is just, again, as this acoustic representation toolbox, it's very exploratory. But this is just kind of just a novel approach that we've come up with that we would love to consider experimenting with, but there's so many problems in bioacoustics that maybe we'd love some help with that from the open source community.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're at the very beginnings of all this stuff. So I don't think we haven't done the ablation studies and all the other like landscape analysis to fully know yet. But that leads us to the next question from Julie, which is what volume of data are we using to apply these methods of denoising? How much is necessary to do the training?
This is a question we get a lot. It's a very hard question to answer because we can't say, oh, we need like 13,123 examples, right? It kind of depends on the complexity of the task. For reference, for the classification tasks, we've used about 4,000 macaque calls for those classification CNNs that I described earlier. But then for the source separation, we use about 750. So it's hard to say how much, like the minimum amount of data that we would need, but it's always great in machine learning to have as much data as is possible, which I know is very hard, especially in the bioacoustics domain.
So Karthik Ashok asks, can the reconstructed model for noise elimination be used to eliminate unwanted impulse sounds, like snapping shrimp, but recognize overlapping broadband signals such as dolphin clicks?
So again, this is something totally worth exploring. It's actually a problem I've been working with a dolphin detector, dolphin whistle classifier as well as another project. And that's definitely a problem that I've heard about, come across while working with dolphin data. It's something worth exploring. Presumably, and this is just a guess, a hypothesis at this point, but so with this reconstruction, we feed it noise background. So if you have like snapping shrimp, for example, if you have like instances where you know that there are snapping shrimp, then presumably you could use those as inputs to this VAE, and then like, so if you had enough, then hypothetically you'd be able to reconstruct, your model should be able to reconstruct that background noise, as long as it's not these whistles, if that makes sense.
So I see there's one more question from Julie.
Okay.
I got a note from Neil saying we're trying to keep these to 1 hour. So what I think we'll do is we're going to pass this over to Katie, okay, to finish up. You're muted, Katie. And then if there's time for more questions at the end, we'll just go for however long. Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter.
Yeah, thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Great. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. 1 minute. Oops, sorry. All right, great. Okay. Hello. As Peter said, I am Earth Species Project Chief of Impact and Conservation Technology, and I really want to take a beat and deeply thank the open source, machine learning, and biology communities for helping us get to where we are so far. It's because of all of your incredible fieldwork and breakthrough research that we've been able to gain intuition about how to work with bioacoustic data, deepen on our understanding of how to apply machine learning to answer these research questions. You've heard from Asa and Peter about our road ahead, and we're so excited to have you all be part of it. We want to give this is a quote from Jane Goodall. We're just so grateful and honored that she's lent her voice to this this mission as well. But we really want to thank a few folks in particular that helped us develop our understanding. Julie Ellie and Frederick Thusen for their research on zebra French calls, Christina Mumm and Miriam Milchchild for their work on giant otter vocalizations, Makoto Fukushima et al. For their research on macaque coo calls, which enabled us to begin to test our approach on the cocktail party problem, and Joseph Pratt et al. For their research on Egyptian fruit bat vocalizations. I want to give a shout out to Oliver Adams, who I saw on the call from the open source community, who tuned this massive data set of around 300,000 vocalizations for machine learning, and recently added it to the Earth Species library. All of these researchers I just mentioned have made their bioacoustic data sets available to the public, enabling us to explore this data and be able to share it in the open source on GitHub. One of the things that we're most excited about is being able to teach others how to apply machine learning to bioacoustics and support field biologists. So we've shared this all this work that we just discussed, as well as all of our other explorations on GitHub to maximize access and understanding of these novel techniques. Please come and introduce yourself. And if you're a biologist on the call, I've seen a lot of familiar faces, as well as some folks that I am so inspired by your field work. if you're interested in applying these techniques in your research or want to contribute to the ESP library, please let us know. Here's my contact information. Deep learning thrives on complex, large, and diverse data sets. And I also want to thank Michelle Fournet of Cornell, Fred Sharp of the Alaska Whale Foundation, and Lisa Walker of Grooved Whale for contributing humpback whale vocalizations, Peter Reg of Cornell, and Christos Astaras from the Forest Research Institute in Greece for contributing vocalizations from their fieldwork in Cameroon and Greece. Most recently, a data set of tawny owls, and Leila Sayeg of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute for sharing dolphin whistles. We hope that these data sets, as well as others, will help us answer the cocktail party problem for a multitude of species. And we deeply appreciate working with all the aforementioned to help answer this question. The more heterogeneous and complex the data sets in our library, the harder and harder training we can provide our models, and the more empowered we will be to answer the cocktail party problem for many species. And ultimately, we believe, to answer the big question, how can we decode animal communication and language? Each species and call type provides a unique set of features to deepen our understanding of how algorithms perform. And applying the research of, let's see, where is that paper? Here it is. Applying the research of Alexis Cano and Guillaume Lampol et al., our approach is fundamentally comparative. How can we develop an understanding of humpback whales in the North Pacific as a key to decode humpback whale communication in Eastern Australia? Will an understanding of captive dolphin whistles provide a Rosetta Stone to unlock wild dolphin whistles? And can we apply this approach to dolphin whistles as a means to translate from cetacean language to Silbo-Gomero human whistle languages? To the many biologists, information theorists, and computational linguists with whom we're working, we're deeply honored for your support and your time. Thank you so much for helping us think through these approaches and how they apply to your research questions and support your conservation focus. And with that, want to turn back to any questions people have for us and just say thank you. Thank you to you all. Excited to have you part of it. I'll stop sharing. Cool.
Yeah, and one final big thank you to the interspecies.io crew, Diana and Peter and Vint and Neil for creating such an incredible like convening and platform and forum to have these conversations. It is just so exciting. So with that, let's just move to questions that people have. I guess we can either ask, or you could dump them into chat and then we can say them to people. Yeah.
So